We're live.
Okay. At 6 o'clock, I will call to order this workshop meeting of the Columbia Borough Planning Commission. This meeting has been duly advertised, and I would ask members to be sure that their mics are on. I've been told this has happened several times, that we couldn't be heard because we didn't have our mics on. You have before you the minutes from the May 21st workshop meeting. Do I have a motion regarding approval of those minutes? I have a motion from Nathan. Do I have a second?
I'll second it, Mayor.
I have a second from Brad. Any discussions, corrections, comments? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Okay, moving on here. I had a chance to have discussion with Jessica before the meeting here. And one of the concerns at this point in doing anything with zoning, I will assume, maybe assume is the wrong word, that all of you are aware that the borough manager is leaving.
Didn't know that.
So his resignation was tendered and accepted at last week's council meeting. So they are advertising, I think he gave them 4 weeks.
July 3rd will be his last day.
Okay. So at this point in discussion with Jessica, there's concern about direction, how we want to go with the zoning. And the zoning map amendments and the changes in the zoning itself have to go hand in hand. So I think at this point, unless we get some direction from council to proceed, at this point, we're going to focus on the short-term rentals. If I would appreciate feedback from members of the commission here, members of the board with those thoughts.
I'm in agreement.
We've got our comp plan now, and we were waiting for our comp plan also to be able to have in front of us to proceed with our zoning changes. So I think eventually we will be getting to the changes, the consolidation of the zoning districts, eliminating some of them, combining zoning districts. How many do we have right now? We have like 17 zoning districts, which we would like to combine into fewer. And to be able to do that, you have to have the text to go with it. So at this point, we will still keep this out there, but it won't be the focus of our workshop.
Not this evening.
Not
at any
this
rate.
evening,
They're just
until we get some direction.
Right.
Either from council or from staff, what direction they want us to go. In fact, Jessica and I were even talking about the idea of form-based zoning, which is a concept I have a little difficulty wrapping my head around. And in the simplest term, form-based has to do more with your streetscape, maintaining a streetscape. as opposed to maintaining what is within that zoning. Do I have my head around
You
it
do,
right?
yeah, absolutely. So essentially, when we're thinking about a form-based code, switching that, and the way we were talking about it would have been really a great way to do it, because what I see for the borough is a hybrid use of form-based code, where I think in our residential areas, we'll use the same zoning that we have now for the most part. But then in our commercial areas and our mixed use and downtown areas, what we need to do is essentially character surveys of blocks or sets of blocks to identify this is the streetscape pattern in this area, so that essentially what our zoning ordinance, our form-based code is doing is advocating that regardless of the use that you're going to put in this structure, we've got a street with tree wells, with tree-lined streets, with uniform sidewalks, street furniture, there's a door well space, and you're making sure that your development is not, there's no setback necessarily, but there is a build to line. We want to make sure that uses are built up to that build to line and they're all rear loaded. So essentially, if you have parking, that all of that is behind the building. And it relies on, we want to very specifically dictate the built form and a little less dictate the use of that structure, because as long as that structure, within reason,
Mhm.
but essentially it's not going to matter a whole lot if it's a tax preparer's office or if it's a salon, so long as that structure and that meets the fabric of the surrounding area. Because what it's seeking to combat is that so often we put regulations in a zoning ordinance, and you see this a lot in urban areas where a suburban style ordinance has been utilized, and then you start getting this development that just doesn't match your historic fabric in any way, and it just looks out of place, and it leaves the pedestrian sort of stranded in a portion of a block. Like, for instance, if you've got the amount of fenestration is dictated so that the windows and the clear spaces that the pedestrian can see into is really important. We want to dictate that if we're talking about townhouses, that when you're talking about the block face, they're standing up, so that way people in their living room aren't looking out eye level at people on the street. So just more dictating that form of development.
With something like this block of Locust Street,
Is a perfect example.
because you've got the former Wells Fargo Bank set back. Everything else is set out along a given
That's
line.
exactly what I mean.
Okay.
Yep. So in a form-based code, what we would be doing is we would have approved building styles in that code for this particular area. And so that way, if somebody purchases the bank and they want to take it out, because honestly it doesn't fit, with this massive parking lot, drive-through, and setback, somebody could put in what we do actually want to see in this block. A lot of the examples that are thrown out are, when you do have a block like this, but then immediately across the street, you've got this 4-story concrete structure that's got one ingress point and very few windows, and it makes it difficult for the pedestrian. It takes away that sort of thriving feel. People don't want to be on that sidewalk. You're sort of stranded out there, and we want people to feel incredibly comfortable in our public spaces. And I guess one of the things that's interesting about form-based code is we're really less interested about what's going on behind the door, and we're trying to format the public spaces of the borough. So it's very much concerned with the relationship of that development to the street.
I think Ribbits has
Yeah.
form-based. So if you want to see what a form-based code looks like, Ribbits has one. So
That's the best way I can explain it. So our traditional zoning ordinances want to control what's done inside the lot. The form-based zoning ordinance, yes, we are going to dictate that, but that's a little less of a priority, and more of the priority is making sure that we are creating these public spaces that we need, sort of taking back the street a little bit. and building out other public spaces.
Okay, with that, we'll move on to our short-term rental.
Yes.
Justin couldn't make it this evening, but there's a copy of an email that you were all given, and it has his thoughts on short-term rentals. And I think this kind of matches with what you were asking the last time for us to look at
Mhm.
the short-term rental approach and get back to you with that.
Tiffany and Brad, I also had your comments forwarded to me. So I think I just read through Justin's. I did have more of a chance to read through your comments. And I think that the template that I provided got to most of your comments. I tried to identify areas of discussion. So I'm not sure if that's how we want to run through this ordinance and go through those areas of discussion.
Well, you take it through it, Jess.
Okay.
So,
All right, so a little bit of background. This is I'm going to get it wrong. It's either Monroe or Montour. I can't remember. Monroe. So this was based on their ordinance, and what I did was I took the existing short-term rental regs that we have, and where it made sense to put stuff in, that's what I did. Mark and Paula and I met probably about, May 30th. We met May 30th to go through the procedural aspect of the text amendment, just to make sure that all of the requirements that we had made sense, that they were matching back with other sections. So you'll see in here, we've got changes that we're making to Chapter 220 zoning, but then we also have changes we're going to be making to Chapter 166 rental property.
okay.
So the very first part of this, we get into new definitions. And I think we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new definitions that we're adding. We're proposing to completely change out the definition of person in charge. So the difference between the two definitions, the existing definition that the borough is using, the person in charge is the person who leased the short-term rental. Typically, the person in charge is someone who's got some sort of authority or ownership on the rental itself. And that's the person who needs to be available. Their information needs to be publicly visualized in the rental unit. We need to have that information on file. Some municipalities dictate, and I think we're doing that in this ordinance, has to be within 15 miles of the short-term rental. So I'll leave that there. Is there any discussion on that definition change?
I'm in agreement.
Yes.
The
new definition of person in charge is okay with us.
Okay. Bedroom is new. The reason I like this definition is this gets to something that we saw with 144 Locust Street. Remember that unit? So that was the reno that was done. They've got the black. Did they paint it black? Right, and then metal roof,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
So we issued that certificate of occupancy, but specifically, and also in the building permit itself, specifically stated was that the very third floor could not be used as a bedroom because it didn't have the appropriate sized window to use as a secondary egress. So that's one of the reasons why I like this definition, is because it gets to that, it talks about that area not being able to be considered a bedroom. Short-term rental, the definition of a short-term rental, I'm proposing a modification. I just like that definition better, the proposed one. It essentially has the same information. And then just we're defining the permit and the fee. Paula and Mark and I did discuss increasing the fee. I definitely think the fee should be increased. The discussion was essentially fees range anywhere from like $200 to $2,000. So what we sort of talked about was a $500 initial short-term rental license fee, and then every year you renew it, it's $250.
Okay, and this is a fee that is set yearly by resolution.
Correct.
This is part of the fee schedule that's adopted
Yeah.
every year by Borough Council.
So
Like-
what goes with when they renew it, does another inspection have to be done?
Yep. That's all in here. So we'll get to it. That's part of the process. Yep. So fee schedule resolution. Yes.
Jessica, does that seem to be in line with other surrounding boroughs?
I did not check that. I can. I think
It
it's.
seems like it's low.
It seems a little low to me too.
Only, yeah, and Tiffany and I were discussing this. Not quite sure what the fee should be, but I think the lower these rental license fees are, the more apt we are to not have the people
Yeah.
there
I
that
can
we
check.
want to have.
I can check and do a survey of the surrounding Lancaster communities. Absolutely.
And
And
because we want to know they take it seriously. But
Mhm.
also there's then that investment in Columbia, like giving one at the start
Yep.
each year.
And not just quality people, we want the residents to be quality. Also, one thing that's going by the wayside.
And the thing with that fee, we can make a recommendation, but setting that fee is on council.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
They have the
And
final say.
solicitor.
Well, and I agree, Brad, that is a very good research product to, that is a good thing to do. I can't use my words,
I
I'm so
understand
sorry.
I understand.
And the fee won't be arbitrary, and council will have a better
Mhm.
time approving it. Okay, so I know that there's gonna be discussion here, so, to be added to chapter 220 zoning, section 220-25, the table of permitted uses. So right now, these are the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 zoning districts, current zoning districts that we're willing to allow, short-term rentals in. And the question I have for the planning commission is there any further discussion that we need to have on that?
So you're going into neighborhood commercial. I think you're okay with that. There's traffic in anything that's commercial. There's movement,
Right,
there's
you're
traffic.
right.
You've got,
People work for businesses.
right,
Essentially, where we wanted to put it was in our mixed-use areas and our
Right.
downtown areas.
So basically what you're saying is there is a commercial building that you can have in that block, that you can have short-term rental. Is that what you're saying?
No, that's not what I'm stating. What I'm saying is just in general, in terms of the zoning districts that we picked, we're essentially identifying all of those zoning districts in the borough that are commercial or mixed use in nature. Because neighborhood commercial is mixed use, just it's commercial plus residences.
Institutional, residential, that's not mixed use, is it?
Definitely.
What's permitted there?
It's medical offices and residential.
So which of these though carry over into the, none of these are high density residential because
No.
that's a separate.
Yep.
separate,
Right.
Okay, so. Yeah. I'm not going to do it. Okay.
I'm voting on conditional residential.
I can't hear
Did we talk about that last time?
Do you have your mic on, Nathan? We can't hear you.
Well, and make sure that your mics are pulled up to you because they won't pick you up if you're not talking to it.
Institutional residential, didn't we talk about that last time? Was not a bit of an issue? Or did that? It's a different area, it's not on this list now. Because of the density. It's a pretty dense residential area.
the institutional residential, does that mainly comprise the high rises?
My understanding is that institutional residential is the area around the doctor's offices, that neighborhood. What is that? Is that Maple?
Up on North 7th.
7.
Yeah.
And then
North 7th.
does that include up by St. John Hurst Gate too?
That's rural residential.
Okay.
We don't have a map.
We don't, we should have a zoning map in here that would make it,
Well, there's one on the wall.
Oh, is there? Oh, here it is.
So can you just kind of highlight where the institution?
Yeah, institutional residential is this area in here.
Oh,
You're talking about the hospital?
Well, I mean, that's,
Where it was.
Right.
what is it down, what is the big brown area sort of in the middle? What is that?
here,
Yes.
that's high density residential.
Okay.
So what this is referring to, institutional residential, are the houses across, the row houses across the street from the hospital? Is that referring to that area?
I can't tell you, all I can tell you is that institutional residential is along it's like the end of North 6th Street along Poplar.
I don't have an issue with it.
Yeah,
I think I misunderstood which one that was. I was confusing it with something else. So,
high density residential is what we talked about, and there was not a level of comfortability there with allowing short-term rentals there.
all right, yep, then I'm good.
Okay, moving into, let's see, is this the meat? No, the next section is, this is essentially for staff, for the people administering the ordinance. So the next page is 2, 3, into 4. So it would be, so 220-31D, 13A, B, and C are all of the procedural regulations. On page 3, we're identifying that we're going to talk with Evan a little bit about what he thinks the insurance requirements should be. Is everybody on board with if the owner resides at a location over approximately 15 miles from the short-term rental property, an agent or local contact person must be selected to act as the person in charge of the property?
Definitely,
Yeah, I think there definitely should be.
definitely.
I would prefer they actually, that one is there, but if not, then, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Shouldn't have to call somebody in New York and Philadelphia.
No.
In Baltimore, yeah.
So the next big discussion points are D, short-term rental standards. This is the meat. So this is what we're going to hold our short-term rentals to.
Okay, we're on page 4 now.
Yep. So number 1, and this is from the existing ordinance, short-term rentals are to be leased as a single unit. Individual room rentals are strictly prohibited.
Correct.
The next one is new. Overnight occupancy of a short-term rental shall be limited to no more than 2 persons per bedroom with a maximum of 10 occupants. 3 is existing but reworded slightly. There shall be no overnight guests other than the members of the entity renting the facility. 4 is a discussion point. It's about daytime guests. The maximum number of day guests allowed at any one time, in addition to the overnight occupants, shall be 75% of the maximum overnight occupancy of the short-term rental. So if we're at a max of 10, we're talking about 7 folks and a baby
Mhm.
coming over for something, for dinner, a party, something.
How are we finding daytime? Seems ambiguous.
People visiting during the day that aren't staying overnight.
Right, but like, what if they're there till 2 in the morning, but they don't sit there and they go home?
We're not defining the time of day, but we also have to think about how are we going to enforce that?
Yeah, Yeah, no,
That's
why.
the, so I would say, you know, clearly if it's nighttime and they're there at 2 o'clock in the morning and they're causing an issue that we need to pay attention to, then we can say to them, these people can't, you have too many people here.
Well, I appreciate it after 5 where you do address quiet hours. So that kind of addresses that.
Um,
Yes.
Okay, but back to the visitors.
Right, so what I'm proposing in 4 is different than what's existing. What's existing is no persons other than members of the entity renting the short-term rental shall be allowed on the premises during the period of occupancy. No planned personal or business events as described in the short-term rental registration form shall be held at the short-term rental site. So really the question is, how do we feel about daytime guests and how do we feel about people holding events?
I think it's a disruption to the neighborhood, and I think we should be considerate of that, whether they are or not, I don't know. Be 75% high, if you do 50%, if they come during daytime hours, I don't know.
That's up to you guys.
What's the reason for changing this at all?
Again, it's up to you guys. There's one path. One path is more restrictive than the other, and it just depends on what you want your short term. I mean, essentially, it's a business that it's a new use that we're identifying and regulating so that it's more transparent and more people can do it.
The reality is, how are you going to enforce that?
We can't. The only way we'd be able to enforce
Such
it.
an amount that there's a complaint, basically.
The only way we'd be able to enforce it is if somebody made a complaint.
And then you would have this fallback.
So there was nothing in the existing one that allowed outside guests to come in that weren't on that one.
So think about it this way. So and I'm not picking on you guys, but you guys said you went to a short-term rental and had dinner there. Based on the borough's existing regulations, that was a violation of the short-term rental regulations.
I don't agree with that.
So that's how strict do we want to be? I think people can have events and parties. What we should not be creating zoning legislation for the bad apple. That's just not the way zoning should work. It creates more problems than it does solve potential future problems.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. If yes, you're in town, you've rented an STR, and you have your family come in for a dinner or
Right, you want to
something.
have a family.
You know,
dinner.
how, and that it's more than this 75%.
As long as everybody's,
You tell your family they can't come?
well, as long as they're hitting all the other requirements, like legitimately, there is not enough
Right.
staff here to go through and knock on the
Right,
doors
you
and make
can't.
sure that everybody's, and you're gonna have turnover. If these people are doing it right, they're gonna be different people week to week to week staying there. That's not something we can legitimately keep up on.
Well, I think you're renting it to adults, and I think adults, mostly adults, are respectful. To a family comes in for dinner, and put a number on it is one thing, but then I'm saying. Do we mention it at all?
It's in the template. I would at least go with what's in the template. And I think you should discuss how making it transparent is best for everybody. So either we're going to allow additional guests in the daytime and we're going to stipulate what we think that amount should be. And we're going to dictate whether or not they can or cannot have an event, or we won't. It's up to you guys and your level of comfortability.
I could say based on what I've been through, Tiffany and I have been through. We have 2 elderly friends that have family that live in Philly, Virginia, and some locally. And their home is a small cottage up at St. Anne's. They cannot have people. It's hard enough when they have us come in just to sit down to have dinner. It's real small. So they, up on the 1000 block, I think it's the McConnelly's,
Yes.
have the rental unit up there. And so they have birthday parties and their Christmas parties and Thanksgiving and different things to it. And it's not a lot of people. They have 3 children, 2 grandchildren. Sometimes it's us, a couple other people. And it's a quiet celebration. They do have a large yard. The barbecue is used. It's all done by adults. Not to say that there would never be children running around. I don't think that we should be so restrictive that we can't have people coming for a dinner, coming for the celebration. I'm not sure that we should be having grand wedding events with tents. That should be more.
Well, and I think
that
that
should be
that's,
more
I
of a
think that that's
venue.
covered
Yeah,
in your,
that's
in a
covered
further.
Right,
that
that's
you
just-
can erect.
And so you're getting, so yes, we're okay with some small events, but if you limit the number of daytime people, and this also says you can't put up any structures in the yard.
Right.
So,
Right, but
Yeah.
you had originally said that we would have been in violation. And I do understand as it's written
as it's
now,
written now.
and I don't agree with the way it's written now. I think that if we have, or our friends have, or any of us have,
Like,
people that come in from out of state
Mhm.
and they don't have room at their home, like I wouldn't have room in my home to have.
The other part of this is, let's not forget that the entities themselves that help book the short-term rentals, there are avenues with which to complain, with which to pull a license, rescind a license, with which to make it so that the owner of that property can't utilize or rent to those places. So the zoning ordinance, we want to regulate this so that it's transparent, so that people can do it. So it makes sense, and then rely on the bad apples are going to get weeded out, though. I
So
see it.
basically what you're saying is that we have to come up with something that would work in a situation that I'm proposing, but come up with an amount of people that can come at any given time.
Well, yeah, so just like
Other
it
than
says,
the people that
75,
are renting it.
so just like it says here, 75%, that's clear, it's transparent. If you don't like 75%, which would probably be about 7.5, maybe you want 50%. So it's a max of 15 people. It doesn't matter. The more restrictive you go, though, the harder it will be for transparency, because we're putting regulations in place that are very difficult for us to enforce.
I think the 75% just, and you're not going to know how many people are there unless there is a complaint.
Mhm.
And then you would have this to fall back on if there are additional persons there. If it's rated for 10 people to be there, and they've got 25 people there, and things get out of hand, they can't have that many people.
Well, and there, look at parking. Parking must meet the requirements for a dwelling unit for
Right.
220-41. The spaces may be in the garage. 7, outdoor parking for overnight and day guests shall be limited to available parking areas on the short-term rental property. In no event shall parking for short-term rental guests include spaces in any public street right-of-way or on any lawns or vegetated areas. So that's really going to, people could start calling the police, complaining about there is something going on at this short-term rental. There are 30 people in the backyard and
Yeah.
they've got our block all parked up.
Yeah. Jessica, in the existing ordinance, 13A is the one that specifies that it has to be in a detached dwelling. Is that going away?
I didn't include it in there. So if you want to have
If
it,
we're going into these other,
and that's the reason,
districts.
that's the reason why I took it out, because we don't
Yeah.
have, if you want to, if we want to encourage short-term rentals in the downtown, there's a,
That's why the medium density residential business was designated, because that was one of the few places where we saw any number of detached dwellings.
if you think of it, this is how I think of it. If you're going to be in the central business district with your
Mhm.
short-term rental, you have chosen to lease that property there.
Right.
Meaning you have chosen to spend a night in a downtown area where you are expecting to hear traffic, you're expecting to hear people walking on the street, you're expecting to hear noises from the occupants in the structures adjacent to you. So there is an expectation that you are going to be in a busier environment, which is why I don't really see the need to have detached structures, because if you're in these areas, there's an expectation that you're going to hear
Yeah.
life outside of
So
your.
in this rewrite, we are
Right.
just ignoring that, that's going away.
I didn't include it.
I was just looking, I have a copy of it here, and I was just going there. Okay.
So is everyone comfortable with keeping 4 to the maximum of 75% and then
Yeah.
eliminating what's highlighted?
I like the hours. Although I like quiet in the afternoon between 3 and now.
8, overnight occupancy of recreational vehicles, campers, trailers, tents at the property where the short-term rental is located shall not be allowed. Outdoor overnight sleeping of occupants or guests at the short-term rental is prohibited.
Mhm.
9, the property shall be compliant with all federal, state, county, and local laws and ordinances, including the borough's existing structures and property maintenance code.
Right.
Here, 10, we get into referencing the nuisance ordinance. 11 does the same thing, and 12 as well. So 10, 11, and 12 are giving us those regulations that allow us to identify a short-term rental as a nuisance, and begin those enforcement steps.
And will there be a 3-strike rule where if they have
I believe it's in here already.
3 different complaints?
And it's actually, yeah, I think it's in here.
That's threaten their license, well, hopefully take away their license.
It's in here somewhere. Fireworks prohibiting, subleasing prohibited. All short-term rentals shall have a clearly visible and legible notice posted within the dwelling unit on or adjacent to the front door containing the following information, all valuable information. Part E is basically your inspection. So Maryland, anytime a license is renewed, the inspection is going to be looking for making sure that E is there. On page 7, we identify the terms of the license. And that follows into enforcement of this ordinance will be done by the code compliance officer, and then we identify the required inspections in part I.
Jess,
Mhm.
can we make all terms for the enforcement officer, I'll say compliance officer?
Do you want it to be code compliance or just compliance?
I would say code compliance.
That's where it should be. So I think that's what I did. I'll look and make sure that we don't have anything else.
Because I'm seeing a lot of enforcement officer, and we talked about being consistent.
Well, okay, we can do that. This one, then, I think what it's doing is it's using enforcement officer, because here we're defining what enforcement officer is, and the enforcement officer is the code compliance officer.
So can we change that to compliance officer? rather
I'll
than
change it to whatever.
enforcement? Okay.
Well, it is code, it is. So the enforcement officer is the code compliance officer.
Okay.
So it's just,
I know in chapter the 112 into 166, that's what we were trying to change everything to.
I understand what you're saying. I can,
Just for consistency purpose.
this is a generic term, enforcement officer.
Yeah.
There is going to be an enforcement officer for any ordinance. It could be a police officer, it could be a zoning officer, it could be a compliance officer. So it's almost like the rest of this legislation is, if you think about an ordinance or a resolution or an agreement, and the borough shall now be known as the owner throughout this document, that's essentially what is going on here.
Okay.
So even though it says enforcement officer throughout, it's stating here that enforcement officer is the code compliance officer of the borough. Does that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah.
And I can still change it if you want to, if
Yeah.
you would prefer that,
Yeah.
and I could take that section out.
So which section are you looking?
Part H on page 8.
Okay.
So Paul, it's whatever you like the most. If you want me to take out enforcement officer and just replace it with code compliance throughout the document, I can certainly do that. And it sounds like that's what you want, right?
Only because of what we're doing with
Okay.
the other. And the purpose of that was consistency.
So
Okay.
anywhere it says enforcement, now it's going to be compliance.
Yeah.
Code compliance.
Or even if you put compliance officer, that can be zoning code, whatever. Can it?
Mhm. It's whatever you guys want it to be. Honestly, I just wanted to make sure that
Is
enforcement officer is not the name of it is not the title of
Right.
the entity doing it. It's just, there will be some enforcement officer in
Right,
charge of
so
this.
you're saying that a compliance officer could be a police officer, it could be Paula's
Enforcement
team.
officer could be a police officer, it could be a zoning person, it could be a building permit person.
Right, so
So-
compliance.
So then we're defining it in part H as, in this particular instance, the enforcement officer shall be the code compliance officer. But if, like I said, we can eliminate that and just make it code compliance officer throughout. It's just the way this
This
template.
sounds like something that needs to be decided. Other than here. I don't think this is something for us as a board to decide. I think if this discussion was had, I don't know if Evan needs to be involved
I don't think so.
or.
I don't think so. We took, Mark and I made those changes in the 112 and 166 chapters
Okay,
because it was,
it went back and forth.
yes. So rather than have 2 or 3 different titles, we made all that. And that's just what brought my attention to this.
But it,
Made it strictly compliant.
But if somebody
But
came
then
to that
that's-
home to enforce grass that was high, that would be code compliance.
Mhm.
If somebody came because there was a nuisance, that would be
possibly.
a compliance officer, such as a police officer.
Could be. It depends on what code it honestly depends on what code
Right.
that you're
Being
citing.
violated.
Yeah.
I guess that's an internal decision that has to be,
And then,
like Mary said.
It's been made. I can change it so
Yeah.
that we're not referencing, I get it. I'll change it. It's okay.
but now down at K, where you have the notice of violation. So you're notifying them that there's a violation. Is there any fine or anything that's gonna go along with that? And I didn't find anywhere where it did reference a 3-strike rule or any type of thing that would cause.
That was the intent, and
lose
if
their
I,
license.
that was the intent, and if it got left out, that's my fault. Because the current,
I'm not seeing anything.
okay, I meant to have it in there and I must have forgotten it. So currently, the ordinance has a 3-strike rule over a 2-year time period. What we're gonna move to is a 3-strike rule over a one-time time period, over a 1-year time period. So I'll add that in.
And so will there be any fines leading up to that?
I would yes, but it depends. So here's why that stuff isn't included. Because if we put it in the zoning ordinance has its own appeals, fines,
Right.
they're identified. And the same thing with chapter 166 rentals. So every chapter, every ordinance that's been codified has its own several sections for appeals, violations, fines. So what the fines that would apply would be fine for whichever ordinance we're using,
Okay.
whether it's the rental property or the zoning.
Okay.
And again, something I would lean on Evan for
Right.
is telling us
This
what.
kind of crosses both of those.
Mhm. All right, that's it in a nutshell.
So what's our next step with this?
I would say that, I guess the next step is does the planning commission want to see a revised draft?
I think a revised draft would be a good idea.
So a revised draft, and then at the July meeting, which is when?
July,
It's the 16th.
16th.
So that would mean at the July 16th meeting, we would be looking for a recommendation from planning commission to send the draft of the short-term rental ordinance to council. And we would be asking for their permission to forward it on to the county planning commission and to establish a review and approval schedule.
And I guess at that point, they would also have something.
They would also have
They
what?
would also have.
Yes.
Evan.
Yep. Mhm.
Um,
I feel
yes,
like,
Nathan.
with that being said, I feel like I should probably just make a note. When it comes to short-term rentals, I'm pretty strongly against any expansion period. While I do think that these new rules are good for short-term rentals, I take issue with expanding further zones, and that is simply because, in my mind, short-term rentals take the place of long-term housing, giving the opportunity for homeowners to do that, especially in a small borough that is already struggling with available housing, and in a borough that has an abnormal amount of long-term rentals already compared to homeownership opportunities. I think that these are generally good, but I disagree with the expansion. So if that's going to continue moving forward, I will most likely vote no. I just want that to be known. I don't want it to be a surprise when it comes down to a vote. But I will most likely be voting no on anything that has anything on language about expanding short-term rental availability in the borough.
Thank you for the heads up on that. The fact that there is a council member who feels that the entire borough should be out on that short-term rentals.
Yeah, that bothers me.
I was actually going to make mention of that too, because our homeless situation is already a huge issue. And each property that's bought to do this takes away from, like you said, homeownership or a dwelling for someone else to live on a long-term basis. That's why I had a hard time expanding most definitely into the high density for multiple reasons, but I can understand your downtown, but, you know, we've gone now into 7 additional areas, and, I was gonna make that, excuse me, concern as well, just because we already have so many long-term rentals. And so it concerns me that it's not gonna be a resident, because then you can have people who just have investment ideas in their mind and target different properties to do this, to make extra money for themselves, who aren't really invested in Columbia or our community, and who might be taken away.
And I'll say, I'm not counting short-term rental. Just, I'm not. Never stayed in one, I have a desire to stay in one. I just want to do the headache to have one on the street. And it's just a nightmare with neighbors coming on my door. What are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about it? It loses the ambiance of a small town community.
Well,
We have so much unknown people coming in and out of here. We don't know what they're doing. What is their purpose for being here? Is it just to visit family? But it's like, if I lived next door to one, I'd be very upset if I had a small child, because now my child can't play out on the sidewalk. I don't know who's coming in and out of here from what town, or what their background is. I don't know any of that. And I've been not a fan for many years, so.
this ordinance, while it does not talk towards your concerns with expansion, Marilyn, this will absolutely help with enforcement. So this will absolutely help with those bad apples that you have had experience with giving the borough some real tools to get those folks out of there.
My question is that there are people coming in and buying properties and not disclosing or doing their due diligence on what they plan to do with it, and then they turn it into a short-term rental. Now they're coming pleading, please, please.
So, and this was a question that Justin had. So this is the ordinance. This is how we're going to regulate it, right? And this is how we're going to make sure that we're getting what we want. There's a whole other side of this that's back office administrative, which is how do we identify where all the short-term rentals are? So there are any number of services that the borough can utilize, and usually you pay on a per permit basis, and it's not that expensive. But essentially what they'll do is they will find all of the short-term rentals being advertised in your community across platforms. And so what that does is, number one, it tells you who's in the areas where we're willing to permit short-term rentals. All these folks need to get a license. So we're sending them a letter. In the areas where they're outside of the areas where we're willing to permit it, they're getting an enforcement letter saying you need to cease and desist. If we put in place the legislation, and then we also have the corresponding back office programs in place, then I think we'll be able to, number one, regulate where we want them, and two, we'll be able to use the enforcement powers that we have to kick them out.
I'm thankful for that, because I'm concerned about the places that kind of slid in there before we had legislation and then say, okay, well, they're grandfathered in because we didn't have it in place.
Yep, and it's an important conversation to follow, because from the Planning Commission's perspective, you know, we've done everything we can with the legislation, but following up on the back office side of how this will be managed is also important. So I would advocate strong that the borough establish a relationship with a company that has the software, just like you do with like buying flight tickets, that will find all of the short-term rentals being advertised in your zip code. And they either fall within the areas that it's permitted or they don't. And it's 2 letters going out. 1, you need a license. 2, you need to stop.
And that was in Justin's
And
comments.
I do think the license fee should be higher.
My comment is that the one up on Locust Street across from the cemetery, it should have never been allowed. I mean, here, the Barrington, an exemption, a special exception, to have it done after the fact. He knew, not that it's not a nice one, don't get me wrong, but it can happen to anybody. They tried to do it over here on Chestnut Street, where it's highly a lot of.
So essentially,
But they allowed it to happen, they moved forward, he came and pleaded his case. He knew ahead of time that it was not allowed, but he went and purchased it anyhow because then he came in for a special exemption. And
what,
my problem is, people are gonna continue to do that.
absolutely, and so, but what I'm saying is that, that's why I'm saying the back office aspect of this legislation is also critically important. Because if you utilize the appropriate partnership with an entity that'll help you track this, then you are going to be finding those folks. How do you advertise for a short-term rental? You have to put it out on the web. There is no other way to do it, other than if you're gonna do it through word of mouth, and then that's not somebody who's super serious about doing a short-term rental. So Marilyn, to get to your point, on a monthly basis, the borough can run reports. These are all of the short-term rentals that have been advertising across platforms. So this won't catch everybody, can't catch those word of mouth folks, but this will catch all the people that are advertising online. If they're advertising in a place, in a zoning district that is not permitted to have short-term rentals, then Paula has the ability to send out enforcement letters and track those. Does that make sense? It doesn't make sense?
We have found a few
I understand what you're
in the
saying.
past.
Very frustrating to watch
We can't stop people from doing,
I understand that.
people are always
Just like
gonna,
we can't stop people from buying houses and turning into single-family rental properties.
No.
We can't stop it.
and honestly,
We can regulate it, we can make sure it's done properly.
and honestly, if you think about it, what's more important is stability in tenure, right? So the borough has a significant issue with just substandard, kind of dilapidated rentals where someone's just renting them just for the money, right? That's not a rental tenure issue. That is an owner issue. That's an issue about somebody not keeping up their property. But from the standpoint of tenure, home ownership, and rentals, what we want, it shouldn't matter whether someone's renting or a homeowner. What we want is long-term, stable tenure. We want the residents living in our neighborhoods to be long-term residents in their neighborhoods. So we need to be thinking of strategies to be stabilizing those rental tenures. So do we need redevelopment projects that are going to redevelop those units, make it so that someone can stay there longer? Are we going to have the supportive services in place so that someone who's dealing with financial issues, abuse issues, substance abuse issues, that they have the skills in place that they can make the borough a stable living situation for them?
And I think at this point, people want to spend time in this borough.
Yes.
People want to visit this borough. They want to spend their money in this borough. And where are they staying? Where can they stay?
Yeah, that's why I like the one with in the downtown.
The short-term rentals are the way to get people here. And they come back, and their friends come back. And I see it as a way to help the borough economically.
And this will also help those problem areas, Marilyn. And please don't, I hear everything that you're saying, and I'm not discounting anything that you're saying at all. But I think that this legislation will help get to those problem cases that you have seen in your neighborhood or around.
And if
The borough.
people come knocking on your door, you tell them to call the police and call the borough. You're not there to enforce the borough's codes. If they have an issue, and that way the borough knows what's happening, that there are issues up there.
Don't worry, I'm not on my door.
Okay.
And I come right here.
Okay.
They're not talk.
Mm-hmm.
All right,
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you
anything
guys.
further and.
No,
After this.
The only other thing I'd say is maybe for next month, if we want to review the nuisance ordinance. So Paula, if you and I want to put our heads together, come up with a draft, we can review it with the planning commission and get their feedback and sort of push that forward, because regardless of whether there's a leadership change or not, we know that the nuisance ordinance is a big priority as well.
Right.
So, and that would be taking care of one of those loose items on a list forever.
That's actually referenced there at the end
It is.
of the STR.
Yep. And so the STR ordinance should be referencing sections in the nuisance ordinance, which we don't have yet. So,
Okay.
yeah.
All right, anything further for the workshop? If not, I will entertain
Yeah,
at 7:01, a motion to adjourn. Do I have such a motion? I have a motion from Tiff. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second from Marilyn. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay.
All right, thanks guys very much.
Okay,
Have a
thank you.
short, quick rest of your regular
Have a happy
meeting.
4th of July.